So I brewed a double-sized batch following the Tree House Hazy IPA framework. It's loaded with hop flavor from a big dry hop with Citra, Amarillo, and Simcoe. Half of that beer was brewed with Bootleg Biology Secret Clubhouse blend yeast. That's the one I'm drinking right now. And then 2.5 gallons of that was fermented with Ebbegarden Kveik yeast. That's the one we're going to talk about today. So how does the Ebbegarden yeast work for a hazy IPA? How does it compare to the Bootleg Biology Secret Clubhouse blend? Is it a yeast you should check out? Well, my name is Brent, and this is Cascades Homebrew. As I mentioned, I brewed a double-sized batch of the Tree House Hazy IPA recipe. I put out a video where I talked about the Tree House framework. What did they recommend? What was my process and my recipe that I brewed? And then I did an evaluation of that beer and see how it tasted. The beer turned out great with lots of hop flavor, and the yeast character was pretty interesting as well. That batch was fermented with a special release from Bootleg Biology called Secret Clubhouse Blend. It was supposedly mimic some of the Treehouse yeast character. I'm not sure if that's true or not. Then I used 2.5 gallons of that wort to make a tropical IPA, pina colada inspired. It had Brew 1 hops in there, but also a lot of coconut and pineapple. That one turned out pretty interesting. I got a video on that one as well, so check that one out. So is this my attempt to try to milk 3 videos out of just one brew day? Or maybe it's a great way to turn one brew day into 3 different unique beers. Maybe it's a great way to learn about yeasts. Maybe it's a great way to make 3 really interesting videos. Well, stick around and you be the judge of that. Let's just take a quick look at the recipe and the brew day. Scaling down the recipe to target 2.5 gallons or 9.5 liters of finished beer into a keg, it looks like this. The grain bill, 85% of a 2-row pale malt. So that's 6.5 pounds or 2.8 kilograms. 10% flaked oats. That'd be 0.75 pounds, 340 grams. And then 5% carafoam. That's 0.375 pounds or 170 grams. The mass schedule on this one was at 152 degrees Fahrenheit or 67 degrees Celsius. The start of the boil added just a little bit of warrior to add 20 IBUs of bitterness. Then at 20 minutes left in the boil, there was a flavor addition of small amounts of each of that Citra, Amarillo, and Simcoe. 0.125 ounces or about 4 grams each. The target was about 5 IBUs of each. Then at flame out, I added the same amount of that Citra, Amarillo, and Simcoe. For the yeast, I used half a packet of the Ebbegarden dry yeast. This is the same yeast I used for that tropical IPA. The description of the Ebbegarden yeast says, flavor and aroma is tropical fruit. Ebbegarden enhances bitterness and is recommended to adjust to a lower IBU. So my hopes for using the Ebbegarden yeast with that tropical fruit character would shine through, and it worked well in this beer with the hops. And then I was hoping that enhanced bitterness it wouldn't be much of a problem. Well, we'll see. After chilling the wort down to about 90 degrees Fahrenheit or 32 degrees Celsius, I filled 2 of my small fermenters. Both of these will get the Ebbegarden Kveik yeast. Despite these packs only having 5 grams total yeast, they seem to work fine to ferment a full-size batch. So I divided the pack roughly in half, say 2.5 grams of yeast, into each about 2.7 gallons or about 10 liters of wort. Fermentation started off around 84 degrees Fahrenheit or 29 degrees Celsius. It took about 4 days to reach final gravity. During that fermentation, the temperatures hovered in the 80-84 degrees Fahrenheit range, or 27 to 29 degrees Celsius. Then the beer stayed in the chamber for several more days, just giving time for the Secret Clubhouse batch to catch up. At that point, I moved both batches into the same chamber, where they both followed the same temperature and dry hopping schedule. The schedule there was a soft crash down to 45 degrees Fahrenheit, or 7 degrees Celsius, then raise the temperature back up to 60 degrees Fahrenheit or 16 degrees Celsius, and then add the dry hops. This is where the hop amount started to get a little interesting. The dry hops had a total of 5.25 ounces or 150 grams total. That's 1.75 ounces or 50 grams each of that Citra, Amarillo, Simcoe. Remember, this is a 2.5 gallon batch, just a little under 10 liters. I do worry a lot about oxidation with hoppy beers, but I've had good luck with just quickly adding the dry hops into the fermenter through the small opening in the top. The funnel helps to speed up the process and helps avoid a mess as well. 2 days after adding the dry hops, I cold crashed the beer, and then 3 days later when I had time, I did the transfer into a keg. I purged the keg and followed my closed transfer process, trying to avoid oxygen exposure. Quickly looking at the stats for this beer, so the efficiency 75% gave me an original gravity of 1070, which is right on target. So the attenuation on the Ebbegarden was 79%, with a final gravity of 1014, or an ABV of 7.5%. The Secret Clubhouse yeast had a little bit more attenuation at 82%, which gave me a final gravity of 1012, so an ABV of 7.7%. So I knew I was going to be away on a 3-week vacation, so I made sure to film a video of the tasting while I thought the beer was pretty fresh. So I did bring back 175 grams of a variety of hops from my trip to New Zealand. So if you're interested in hoppy beers, make sure you check out for some future videos using those hops. Well, let's go back where I tasted the Ebbegarden Kveik yeast, and I see how it tasted compared to this Bootleg Biology Secret Clubhouse Ben version. So here I am with 2 beers. So the one with the white label, that's the Kveik yeast. The one with the Ebbegarden, the one with the black label, that's the one that was done with that Bootleg Biology blend. So I wanted to give these a valuation, how the Kveik beer turned out, and then specifically, how does it compare with the Bootleg Biology blend? If you look at the appearance, they're both pretty identical. Right now, the Ebbegarden one looks maybe a little bit more hazy, so I think it shows a little bit more darkness to it. But overall, I would say the appearance on them is very similar. What about the aroma? So definitely a little difference in aroma. So with the Bootleg Biology blend, I definitely get some of that kind of phenolic, a little bit of a spicy. But when we go with the Ebbegarden one, it's hard to pick out what are the flavors I get out of the hops versus what comes from the yeast. I definitely get more of just straight up kind of, citrus character. So if there's tropical fruit that's coming from the yeast, it's really pretty hard to pick out, especially in the aroma with all those hop flavors in there. And as far as the flavor, it's really nice. One of the comments from Ebbegarden was that said that kind of boosted the apparent bitterness of a beer. And I think I can see that a little bit. I think, since this base beer has a reasonable amount of bitterness, I do think the beer maybe comes across maybe as a little bit too bitter for my preferences. I think the base beer itself was maybe a little bit more bitter for my preferences. And then if the Ebbegarden yeast boosts up the apparent, bitterness of a beer, I think it pushes it up a little bit more. So I think that's one area where this yeast and this particular recipe, I think it would benefit from less bitterness in it. Yeah, tasting the Bootleg Biology one, it just comes out, feels just a little sweeter and it feels a little less bitter than the Ebbegarden yeast one. But mouthfeel and stuff, I think they're very similar. I think the Ebbegarden one finished a little bit higher. That's again some of that kind of, I think there's a little bit of fallacy that final gravity and dryness and bitterness are kind of equal. In this case, you would think then, Ebbegarden must be sweeter, right? If it had a higher final gravity. But that's definitely not the case here. So I have any thoughts about the Ebbegarden Kveik yeast, which is a yeast that I would use again? Well, it's pretty hard to tell in a batch like this. One, it's a recipe I hadn't brewed before, so it's a little hard to pick out any specific yeast character. And as I mentioned, I think this one just comes out a little bitter. So I think a little bit of that is just on the recipe development. I think this yeast would make a lot better in a beer that had less bitterness, because it does seem the yeast kind of brings out some of the bitterness, at least in this one instance here. But overall, I think the Kveik one made a good beer. So I've had these side by side before, or where I've tasted them like one after the other. And I'm not 100% sure which one I prefer. They're both pretty good beers. They have a little bit different character. Like I said, this one's the Bootleg Biology blend. It has a little bit, some phenolics, a little bit more sweetness. I like some of that in a different way. Whereas the Ebbegarden yeast, I think it's got a little bit more, accentuates the citrus, maybe a touch of a tropical fruit in it, which I think I like that part, but I think the sweetness is not there. So I definitely would be curious about using this yeast in a different recipe blend to try to drive that. I'd definitely be curious, like maybe Ebbegarden versus, say, Voss. I think Voss makes a pretty good New England IPA or hazy IPA. So I hope you enjoyed this look in the Ebbegarden Kveik. Make sure you check out some other Kveik and hazy IPA videos. And cheers!